Hi, and welcome to today's talk on developmental coordination disorder. My name is Kendra Gagnon. I'm a pediatric physical therapist and a professor of physical therapy. After today's session, you will be able to understand how developmental coordination disorder, DCD, is defined and diagnosed, identify common impairments, activity limitations, and participation restrictions associated with DCD, and describe basic principles of physical therapy management for children with DCD. Okay, so let's switch gears and talk a little bit about developmental coordination disorder. So, developmental coordination disorder, what is it? How is it diagnosed? What's the cause? Developmental coordination disorder is a relatively new condition. If you think back to your own childhood, once we start talking about this, you'll probably think of somebody who probably had developmental coordination disorder but just wasn't diagnosed. About 5% of kiddos are diagnosed with developmental coordination disorder. And really, it's just defined as motor coordination that's really markedly below the expected levels for their chronological age and intelligence, which interferes with their activities of daily living. And really, this developmental coordination disorder, it's not a genetic condition. It's not, there's not something that can be diagnosed. There's not a test. It's really just diagnosed when children have that motor impairment or motor delay that's impacting their ability to engage in age-appropriate motor activities, and it's really interfering with their function and participation in daily life. We don't know what the cause is. We're doing lots of work looking at the brain and haven't yet kind of defined a single kind of neuroanatomic site associated with DCD, but there are theories about, cerebellar involvement, impaired feed-forward models, looking at, kind of mirror neurons and some of those things. We do know that developmental coordination is often associated with children who were born prematurely or who have other sort of learning conditions like learning disabilities, attention deficit. So one of the biggest myths about developmental coordination disorder is this is just a clumsy kid. They'll grow out of it. And we know that's not true. Without intervention, children do not grow out of developmental coordination disorder. What we see and what some people interpret as growing out of developmental coordination disorder is really what strategies that kids with DCD learn to kind of cope with the fact that they do have these motor coordination difficulties. Children with developmental coordination disorder engage in less vigorous play. They spend more time alone on the playground and they spend less time in team play. It's hard for them to do complex motor skills. And again, once we get to school age, it can be socially isolating and embarrassing. So what you'll do is you'll see kids with DCD removing themselves from those situations. And because of that, children with DCD are at risk for developing some really serious negative physical, social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health consequences. So this is really important for us to understand. Again, intervention early on for DCD is critical. And what we see in DCD is often it's not diagnosed until school age, because early on, if I'm a little clumsy, if I'm a little behind, that doesn't really show up. It doesn't really show up until life becomes more demanding. And now suddenly I need to tie my shoes and I have to do math and I need to be able to run and play ball and jump and climb. And now that gap gets revealed. And so right at the time when kind of that social piece becomes most important is when DCD really reveals itself. And so we really need to be in there intervening and helping kids with DCD learn how to get better, at motor skills, but also how to participate and, use strategies so that they aren't removing themselves from those situations. So impairments we see with DCD, sensory and perceptual deficits. So kids with DCD don't necessarily take in sensory information, process it, or perceive things the same way as the rest of us do. Motor deficits, including motor control and motor learning. And so that idea of kind of creating motor programs and kind of feed forward and feedback mechanisms, kids with DCD aren't able to kind of use those as effectively. Definitely just kind of physical movement and development. And again, social, emotional, behavioral. So this often DCD is associated with things, other kind of social and emotional and behavioral and learning issues like, again, like learning disabilities and ADD. But the DCD can also kind of cause that, because what we'll often see is kiddos who have DCD, maybe they try to learn to kind of be funny to take the focus off of the fact that they aren't able to participate in the PE activity, or they misbehave as a strategy to get negative attention and get removed. So those are all things that you might see. In terms of activity limitations, again, DCD, developmental coordination disorder, is what we just used to call clumsy kid. And so we will see these kids just kind of look kind of clumsy and uncoordinated. They'll have a slower, a more clumsy gait, may have difficulty keeping up with their peers, may have difficulty with some self-care, combing hair, brushing teeth, washing face. Because of those sensory and perceptual deficits, they might not even feel that their face is messy. This is a big one, and oftentimes can be even a larger concern for kids with DCD versus gross motor skills, but those fine motor skills. Kids with DCD really struggle with handwriting. They struggle with tying their shoes. They struggle with cutting, gluing small things on a page. And so in those early school years, they really are challenged with some of those activities. Their gross motor skills may be delayed. They also may be poor quality. So you may just see some differences in quality of movement. Kids with DCD learn compensations, but they also don't necessarily have a good sense of where their body is in space. So, they think they're doing a jumping jack, and what they're actually doing doesn't look anything like a jumping jack, because they don't have that connection of understanding kind of where their body is in space and what their body is doing. Oral motor skills can be an issue too. So, delayed oral motor skills, or frankly, kids just being kind of messy eaters or having some speech issues. The coordination can also impact the movements of the mouth and face. And so, then the really big thing for kids with DCD then is this, how this impacts participation and also kind of the personal factors involved. So what we know is that reduced interest in physical activity can lead to withdrawal and avoidance of sports activities. So this can not only be a social issue, but also can be kind of a health and fitness issue. It becomes a vicious cycle. I'm not very good at physical activities, so I remove myself from those activities, so I don't get better. And then I may even become deconditioned, which causes me to get those things to be even more challenging. So we really need to jump in and break that cycle. We do see limited social and physical participation. These kids learn early on that, that it's embarrassing, or, kids might tease them. These are the kids who don't dress out for gym class. So they're going to kind of remove themselves for these situations. They may be slower to move around the school and playground, which is going to kind of keep them from those social interactions. They may not be able to keep up with the kickball game or the tag game. And then these have obviously big impacts on personal factors. So they may perceive themselves to be less competent. We know kids with DCD may have less or lower self-worth, greater anxiety, and kind of do this self-imposed isolation because they'd rather remove themselves and isolate themselves from the situation rather than put themselves out there and be embarrassed or unable to complete the task. So some intervention approaches that have been shown to be effective for kids with DCD, really we look at kind of these top-down kind of interventions really rooted in kind of motor learning. And so we know that what's the most effective for kids with DCD are really task-specific interventions. So if we're working on playing ball, let's play ball. Let's work on the task. And, it can be a really great strategy to bring in peer models because that can help with kind of some of that motor learning and also some of the social skills as well. Cognitive approaches can be helpful as well. So having, the child perform skills in front of a mirror or videoing them or have them describe the skill or kind of problem solve how they needed to correct it. So really teaching them to really think through those movements and because they don't kind of naturally have those feed forward and feedback, kind of using those cognitive approaches and task-specific interventions to kind of teach them that. And then a huge piece of intervention for children with DCD is education. Oftentimes these kids, people don't understand DCD and they just think these kids are just kind of bad kids. They don't participate in PE. They're at the back of the classroom. They're not getting their work done. Their shoes are always untied. They can kind of get a bad rap. And so we really want to make sure we're educating family, school personnel, community, and other members of the team and understanding that this is actually a disorder that this child has and that we need to help them learn to compensate. So we may need to seat them at the front of the room or make sure that they're standing at the front of the PE room so that they don't lose focus. We may need to assign them to a peer model. And maybe we take a strategy in PE where everybody partners up. So everybody has peer models kind of teaching them. These kids may not understand where their body is in space, so we may need to tape a square on the floor to give them a visual cue of where to stay so that they're not, kind of running and moving all over the classroom. So there are lots of different strategies that we can help. Let's get Velcro shoes so we're not worrying about tying our shoes. Making sure that the teachers learn that this is a child that just might need more time to complete some tasks. And so a little education can really go a long way for kids with DCD in helping their families and their teachers and other members of the team really support them. So I know that was kind of a fast and furious overview of both genetic conditions and developmental coordination disorder, but that is all I have for today. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.